Victoria's political leaders are making their final pitches to voters ahead of tomorrow's state election. Joining me now to break down more of what's happening in the final days of this campaign is Dr. Blair Williams, lecturer in politics and international relations with Monash University. Thank you so much for joining us. What sort of campaign have both leaders run over the last few weeks? How would you describe it?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been an interesting campaign, and I think one that has slid slightly under the radar due to, I guess, everyone perceiving Labor as, perhaps just winning this campaign outright, thanks to the polling we've seen in recent months. But in recent weeks, we've also seen, a reduction in that lead that Dan Andrews previously held. So we've seen a very presidential campaign from Dan Andrews. It's very much about the man himself and whether, Victorians want him again as Premier. And with the Liberal campaign, it seems to be quite a different tactic from the Liberal Party. We're seeing, I guess, more social democratic policies being announced. And I guess a focus away from the economy and more towards, healthcare and schools and public transport.
We know that there's always not necessarily a focus on polling, but this week's polling suggests that Labor could actually lose at least a dozen seats, and talk of a minority government has really come to the forefront. What sort of factors are influencing this, do you think?
I mean, there are multiple factors influencing that. We're seeing, a few Teal candidates put their hat into the ring, and how that will affect the government, it remains to be seen. We're also seeing perhaps minor parties like the Greens perhaps taking a few more seats, and they, a lot of the seats would be away from Labor, like, for example, in the city of Richmond. And we're also seeing, some fringe groups who were very anti-COVID policies, arguing, against what has happened over the last few years and trying to, campaign against Dan Andrews in that way. And we're also seeing a result perhaps after the so-called Dan slide of 2018, where he did pick up some of those seats in the outer, particularly southeastern suburbs that Labor had not really had before. So we might perhaps be seeing, I guess, the reversal of that slide.
It's interesting you mentioned the Teal independents, and we saw the phenomenal success of Teals at a federal level this year. Are we likely to see a repeat of that in Victoria?
Well, a lot of the success of the Teal independents happened in Sydney. So Sydney, Teals won 4 seats, and in Victoria, in the federal election, was only 2 seats. So not as successful in Victoria. But we did see, obviously, Monique Ryan, particularly in Kooyong, win that seat away from Josh Frydenberg. And within that electorate, at a state level, there are quite a few seats, quite a few, seats up for grab for those Teal candidates. Whether they will win it is another thing altogether, because, as you can see on the screen, Hawthorn currently is held by Labor, previously a Liberal seat. Kew currently held by Liberals. So will the Teals... Will they win over the voters enough because of the difference with state elections, and, this being a Labor government, not a Liberal government, and their current Victorian Liberal government is more progressive on climate change than their federal counterparts were at the federal election. So will that have that kind of crossover appeal? Will be interesting to watch tomorrow whether that happens.
It certainly will be. We know over the last few years, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of discontent levelled at Dan Andrews. But now Australia is seemingly going back to normal. Is it enough to vote Dan Andrews out, or have people moved on from that period?
I think obviously people have moved on, but what he did received a lot of popularity, and I think it was very polarised at the time, and the media coverage of that was quite polarised, and a vocal minority seemed a lot louder and a lot more plentiful than they actually were, because as polling showed from the time, the majority of Victorians supported Andrews in his decision for lockdowns and to keep the state safe from COVID. So I don't think that necessarily will come back to bite him as such, and especially as you said, even if that was a thing, it isn't really a thing anymore. There are no current lockdowns. Andrews doesn't exactly have that state of emergency up anymore as it used to. So what would that be saying? Would it have any, effect really? Why would people vote on that matter when it's saying in the past and might not have an effect on the future? So I think that might not be as big as some might argue it would be. But it'd be interesting, nevertheless, to see if that has also had an effect.
Yeah, it certainly will be. Today, Daniel Andrews was out making an announcement surrounding kindergarten and trying to get more women into the workforce. Do you believe that there has been a big enough focus on women in this campaign?
I think there's been quite a bit of a focus on women as well as obviously other issues. Perhaps not as much as we saw in the federal election, and that's for obvious reasons. And that, it was quite a big issue federally in terms of the previous Liberal government, and then what the Labor government, or now Labor government, was proposing to do. Where with the current Victorian Labor government, they have been doing a lot on women's issues over the last few years. I mean, Victoria basically is a state leader on women's workforce equality, on various women's issues. So perhaps there's been slightly less of a focus because there hasn't been as drastic of a need as there was federally. But we've also seen some issues be mentioned, such as the free sanitary products in public toilets, for example, or, as you said, free kindergarten, which obviously not only affects women, but all parents and perhaps even grandparents in Victoria. So we're seeing some things, just I don't think as big as it was, but definitely I think, obviously women's issues and women's vote is still a massive area of importance in this election too.
Just finally, I want to ask you about the Premier, Daniel Andrews, not voting in his electorate on election day. He chose to vote last night with his family. Is it unusual not to vote in your own electorate?
It's pretty unusual, that, and also obviously pre-poll, doing that voting beforehand. Usually, the stereotype, or I guess tradition, is for the leader to vote in their electorate on election day, and it's a massive, photo opportunity. But I think what he's done has gone to show the reality that many are experiencing. The fact that, many voters, millions of voters, are voting early, not waiting to election day to do that, because they now can, thanks to, I guess, the pandemic changing how we vote. And many also don't have time to go to their electorate, perhaps, if they're working in the city or elsewhere. So they might vote in another electorate because it's just easier. So I think it really reflects just the everyday lived realities of people, that it's not neat and as easy as it used to be, perhaps.
Well, a big day ahead tomorrow. We appreciate your analysis, Dr. Blair Williams. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.